During the 1930s, several dictatorships began to rise in power. Among these, Japan was one of the first to begin its aggressive territorial expansion. With no one to challenge them, they continued to seize control of the nations in Asia. By the 1940s, Japan was on the verge of being unstoppable. It seemed as though no one could stand up to the power of the rising sun. Lamar Vincent Polvey was born on April 5, 1922. Known to everyone as Bud, he grew up in the small coal mining town of Kenilworth, Utah. Bud enlisted in the Army on June 29, 1940 at the age of 18. He went to California for basic training at Fort Hamilton. Later, he was one of 3 chosen to attend mechanic school in Baltimore, Maryland. His first assignment was to the Philippines, and he was stationed at Camp John Hay in November of 1941. On December 6, 1941, he took a picture of himself to send to his family. Little did he know that the next day, the whole world would change. December 7th, 1941. At 8 a.m., the first bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor. 9 hours later, the Japanese attacked the Philippines. Their goal was to gain control of the rich supplies and resources on the islands. They stopped supplies to the Allies and bombed the Philippines. The Americans in the Philippines were caught off guard by the Japanese attack, just like they had been at Pearl Harbor. Under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur, the American and Filipino troops stood up to oppose the Japanese forces. MacArthur requested the American government to send more reinforcements, but they never came. The Allied forces were left on their own to face a superior Japanese army. Despite this, they fought valiantly against the Japanese. This band of defenders lasted through 3 months of intense fighting. However, little by little, the Japanese began to gain ground. MacArthur was ordered to report to Australia, but he left with a promise saying, "I shall return." By April of 1942, the Japanese had complete control of the Philippines. Although the Allied forces had courageously stood up against the Japanese, once all the supplies ran out, 75,000 troops were forced to surrender. The Japanese did not anticipate the large number of troops that surrendered. Within days, many with little or no food and water died or were killed. This was only the beginning of the POW deaths. They were forced to march to a number of prison camps in what became known as the Bataan Death March. Bud was reported missing in action in May of 1942. On June 25, 1943, his family received a telegram stating that Bud was being held as a prisoner of war. Bud had been taken to the Davao Penal prison camp where he would spend the next 29 months. It was the Japanese idea that those who surrendered would be treated with less than human consideration as an act of shame. Beheadings, shootings, and beatings were common in the POW camps. Despite all this, there were still prisoners willing to stand up to the Japanese.
Well, I think that Bud had a little bit of a rebellious spark in him, and the fact that he was willing to fight back as much as he could, and the Japanese respected him as a mechanic, and they recognized that he was able to work on their vehicles, and so they actually used him and gave him privileges to be able to work on their vehicles, and he used that as an advantage to be able to work with the resistance a little bit when he was out of the camp and given privileges to work on their automobiles and their trucks.
The resistance was a group of mostly Filipino guerrillas who took a stand against the Japanese. The Americans that were left behind worked together with the Filipino guerrillas to hold off the Japanese forces. While still a POW, Bud coordinated a surprise attack by Filipino resistance fighters who eliminated a group of Japanese troops in a transport. Bud also used his freedom as a mechanic to lessen the suffering of his fellow POWs.
The stories were always told to us that when he was a prisoner of war and they would have him working on their cars and their trucks, he would find ways to put supplies for his fellow prisoners in his beard and hide them and smuggle them back into the camp. Medical supplies or medicine or things like that, he was able to get back into the camp hidden in his beard. And I just thought that was so cool and amazing that he would think of his fellow prisoners and be able to help them in any way that he could.
On August 17, 1944, the Americans bombed an airfield near the Davo camp. The Japanese did not want the POWs to know that the tide was turning. Their goal was to send the 650 remaining men north to Cebu. Eventually, a total of 750 prisoners, including Bud, were loaded on the Japanese cargo ship called the Senior Maru. Due to the inhumane conditions on board, the Senior Maru was given the nickname Hell Ship. September 7th, 1944, the USS Paddle was on a mission to sink enemy cargo ships. It was on its 5th war patrol when it spotted smoke from the Senior Maru. At 4:37 p.m., the submarine fired 2 torpedoes that did heavy damage on the Hell Ship. The USS Paddle had no idea that they had just sunk a ship full of their own men. Out of the 750 POWs aboard, only 83 survived. Unfortunately, Bud was not one of the survivors. In a letter from the War Department, the family received news of his death.
It was very hard. My grandmother, his mother, really never got over his death. So this was sent to his family after he was killed. And so we've had this in our family since then.
On October 20th, 1944, only 6 weeks after the sinking of the Senior Maru, General MacArthur fulfilled his promise to return to the Philippines. Although his return marked the beginning of the end of the Japanese control of the Philippines, only 1/3 of the men he left behind had survived. "I'm a little late," he told them, "but we finally came." The Allied forces continued to gain ground on the Japanese until in March of 1945 when the capital of Manila fell. Finally, after America dropped the atomic bombs on Japan, the Japanese surrendered. The rising sun had finally set, but at the cost of millions of lives. After the war, Bud's family received a letter from General MacArthur, part of which states, "You may have some consolation in the memory that he, along with his comrades in arms who died on Bataan and in the prison camps, gave his life for his country. It was largely their magnificent courage and sacrifices which stopped the enemy in the Philippines and gave us the time to arm ourselves for our return to the Philippines and the final defeat of Japan." In 1998, the men who survived the sinking of the Senior Maru dedicated a memorial to those that lost their lives that day. Although they suffered tremendously, they fought for a just cause. Their story reminds us that standing for what is right and enduring for what is right can lead to the ultimate sacrifice.
Well, I never knew my uncle, but my whole life we heard stories about him. And it matters because he stood up for his country. He went to war and was willing to sacrifice his life for our freedoms.
In grateful memory of Private First Class Lamar V. Polvey, who died in the service of his country, he stands in the unbroken line of patriots who have dared to die that freedom might live and grow and increase in its blessings. Freedom lives, and through it he lives, in a way that humbles the undertakings of most men. Franklin D. Roosevelt.